This is a sermon for the second day of Rosh Hashanah, 2023, 5784. There's an ocean of Hebrew today on the high holidays, which I know is sometimes difficult. I'm going to drop in just one more Hebrew word into the sea. It's a word that doesn't appear in the Torah, probably because, and it's the word conceptia. It's just Hebraicizing the word conception. There are a lot of conceptions out there, but the conceptia refers to the consensus of the Israeli military intelligence in the early 1970s that Israel's overwhelming military victory in the 1967 war would deter future wars. When Yitzhak Rabin, Army Chief of Staff in 67, and the ambassador to the U.S. in 73, came back to the U.S. in the spring 73, he said the nation was far different than the Israel of years prior. The Israel I came home to had a self-confident, almost smug aura to it, as befits a country far removed from the possibility of war, he said. Israeli leadership had a conceptia, which made them confident in their strength. 2020 hindsight allows us to know that they were overconfident, with tragic results. King Hussein of Jordan, still stung by the loss of the West Bank and East Jerusalem in the 67 war, paid a covert visit to Israel on September 13, 1973, and told Prime Minister Golda Meir that Syria and Egypt were preparing for war, but Jordan was staying out of it. The Israelis didn't think much of it. The conceptia was that Israel was all but invulnerable. Days later, Syrian troop buildups were detected near the Golan, but everyone believed in the conceptia, which said not to worry. Egyptian tanks moved near the ceasefire line along the Suez Canal. The families of Soviet embassy staff were evacuated from Cairo. Golda was concerned, but her military advisors assured her there was no need for concern. The conceptia held. She asked if her service should be mobilized? No. A preemptive strike contemplated? No. Golda pressed. The chief of military intelligence, a few hours before Kol Nidre, 1973, smiled and said, "Don't worry, there won't be a war." The conceptia meant that the threat was not just from without. It also, inadvertently, was from within. At 3:50 a.m. on Yom Kippur, 50 years ago, the call came from intelligence who just spoke with an Egyptian spy. Egypt and Syria would launch a coordinated attack that day. Emissaries were sent to wake up a fitfully sleeping Golda, who is too anxiety-ridden to eat before the fast. Francine Klagsmern captures the moment in her fascinating 2018 biography of Golda called Lioness. "I knew it would happen," Golda said after a moment's silence. "Yisrael," she said to an aide, "what do we do now?" She was Hamlet crying, "Oh, my prophetic soul." In her heart of hearts, she had distrusted her intelligence chief's soothing, low probability of war mantra. She had been profoundly disturbed by Russia's evacuation of its civilian families from Egypt. Why had she not acted on the glaring realities and the reserves? At the government meeting the previous day, she had felt in her gut that the reserve forces should be mobilized, yet she allowed herself to be persuaded by the military men that they would have time if that became necessary. Why had she, who had always relied on her intuition, not done so in the most crucial time? Why had she not trusted her own judgment? She would never forgive herself for those blunders. "I will never again be the person I was before the Yom Kippur War," she was to say. Massive attacks came from the northern and southern fronts. Israeli forces suffered heavy casualties and significant setbacks. Disastrous reports began to stream in. It was bad. Golda would later say that on the first full day of the war, she contemplated suicide. Her defense chief, Moshe Dayan, the iconic hero of the 1956 conflict with Egypt and the 67 Six-Day War, declared that the Third Temple is in danger, meaning the state of Israel. To Dayan's mind, the secular rebirth of the ancient Holy of Holies might not last the 5 or 6 centuries like its predecessors. Those in charge of its defense were wondering if it would make it out of its 25th year. Golda had to stop Dayan from addressing the nation on the radio, so despondent was his tone. Golda called President Richard Nixon, begging for help. The Soviet Union was heavily supplying Egypt and Syria with weapons, and the U.S. was then not supplying Israel. The imbalance was dangerous. Nixon, who over the course of his presidency thoughtfully recorded himself using just about every anti-Semitic stereotype and insult known to humankind, also knew that Israel was in some way a representative of one side in the larger Cold War. Nixon ordered conventional arms be made available to Israel. An operation designed to take place secretly under cover of darkness was delayed during a refueling stop So when the cargo planes landed in broad daylight, half of Tel Aviv came out to cheer their arrival. Golda joyfully, publicly kissed the pilots. The Israelis turned the tide, and the state, of course, survived. The Conceptia did not survive, and overconfidence did not. Today, 50 years on, a certain forgetfulness sets in. A different Conceptia has taken hold, a different smug self-confidence is evident, and a different danger lurks. Israel still faces outside dangers in abundance. Sadly now, there's also an internal problem, just as dangerous as the old Conceptia. The Yom Kippur War 50 years ago was the last time Israel faced off with its foes on a battlefield. Security concerns are always present, but they've been different since then. And of course, 50 years ago, any critique of the Conceptia might have been thought of as heresy rather than necessary. And when I look at Israel today, I feel that echo. It has always taken the whole of the Jewish world to help build and sustain Israel, even if its political and military decisions remain rightfully in the hands of its citizens. And I'm not a citizen. I'm, like you, perhaps, a Zionist, a lover of the state of Israel and the people of Israel, and concerned. Like I said yesterday, the March of the Living, I went on followed Yom HaShoah in Poland with Yom Ha'atzmaut in Israel. We went to a wild street party in Tiberias, with streets blocked off, bands playing, and kids having epic silly string battles. Toddlers still out at 10 p.m., a joyous mix of different sectors of society celebrating the fact that Israel, in its 75th year, had a long list of successes, likely beyond its founders' dreams. The next day, we joined over 10,000 Jews from around the world in a celebratory Independence Day march from Jerusalem City Hall to the Western Wall, a proud counterpart to that march from Auschwitz the week before. That night, the Independence Day celebration continued with a concert at Latrun, with a cool drone show in the air, and no less than Israeli superstar than Eurovision winner Netta, a pop singer who got the assembled 10,000 teenagers to chant the F word with her. The impolitic realities of connecting young people to their sacred heritage in the Holy Land. And no, Bubby and Zadie, the F word I'm referring to is not for Klimt. Israel has its share of flaws, and the continuing tragedy of the Israel-Palestinian conflict is a source of real suffering and sadness. And I'm concerned that the new Conceptia might just prevent any more progress and endangers Israel's near miraculous successes. So the first thing I did after leaving the March of the Living participants on the bus to the airport, I went out to engage in Israel's latest Saturday night ritual, the anti-judicial overhaul protest. Now, I know, not a citizen of Israel, though I went with my son Asher, who is. And Israelis will make their own decisions, as they should. But I've listened to a number of speeches from Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he calls on American Jews to be involved with Israel, to be connected with Israel, and that Israel is the home of all Jews. And at that evening that featured Netta on Yom Ha'atzmaut, a government minister came on stage and told the gathered group of diaspora Jews, "Welcome home, Israel is your home. It is an unbreakable bond between Jewish communities in our historic homeland all around the world. And it's pretty common for a friend or family member to give good advice that we have trouble seeing ourselves. And sometimes an outsider can spot a faulty conceptia more easily than those on the inside." Tensions in and around Israel, nothing new, but there's new, more ominous lack of shalom bayit. Israel's government was elected in late 2022, and they won fair and square. By the way, nowadays it's important to clarify concessions. Yet the new government's focus was not on the policies they emphasized in the campaign, but a little noted idea, overhauling Israel's judicial system. That Israel's judicial system is in need of reform is not a controversial idea, and the fact that the fairly elected government gets to head up the effort makes perfect sense. It was the specifics of the proposed reform that sent hundreds of thousands of Israelis into the street week after week, every week for 9 months, tying up traffic, affecting work and school, even according to the defense minister, negatively affecting Israel's security situation. Prime Minister Netanyahu certainly has the right to pass laws he wants and advocate for the policies he wants. Changing the fundamental rules of the democratic game, however, requires not unanimity, but broad consensus. Otherwise, Israeli society is weakened, and security is weakened. If you love Israel as I do, we can recognize we have to call out a dangerous conceptia in Netanyahu's government. The proposed reforms threaten Israel's status as a democratic state. And for those of us who love Israel, who have lobbied the American government to continue its support of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, a nation which shares the cherished values of the American people, the idea that Israel will become more like its autocratic neighbors is a scary proposition. There are a few problematic aspects of what's going on, and I'll highlight just one. The Israeli government's proposal is to ensure that a majority vote in the Knesset could override a decision of the Supreme Court. Remember, Israel has no constitution, no separate executive branch, no two houses of Congress. So the idea is that there will be no legal checks on a Knesset majority. Imagine a situation where anything that, say, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy could get a majority on would not only become law, but would be constitutional. If you like, imagine with Nancy Pelosi, any law that a House majority could pass would be law. No one with a veto pen, no court to strike it down, no constitutional limits, just whatever 50% plus one decides. No limits to the tyranny of the majority. Checks and balances are essential for Israel to fulfill the stirring words of Israel's Declaration of Independence, which says, as David Ben-Gurion read 75 years ago, the state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions. It will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. These are the ideas that Israel's basic laws codify. These are ideas that we can all rally around. These are ideas that our children can use as a foundation for a lifelong love of Israel. These are ideas that can guide a diverse society through its disagreements. These are ideas I want Israel to continue to strive to uphold. These are the words that, according to the Israeli government itself this past week, in statements made in court, these are hastily written ideas and shouldn't obligate Israelis today. The government has backed that idea with proposals for formal gender discrimination, ethnic discrimination, religious discrimination. In a free country, people can have these opinions. To make them into law would jeopardize, beyond just the moral concerns, decades of basing the Israeli-American alliance on shared values, not just sentiment or a temporary alliance. What can we do? Please learn about the situation, listen to an array of positions, support organizations which seek to ensure democracy for all Israelis, those I agree with and those I don't. This is not a very controversial idea. Surveys show that about 70% of Israelis agree with what I've said here. Groups like Masorti strengthen Israeli society. We have to vote in the World Zionist Congress elections. Those are coming up in more than a year, but that helps allocate money to civil society groups. Save Our Shared Home, SOS, helps pay for the protests that draw a wide array of Israelis. I have to say, I actually think Prime Minister Netanyahu truly wants a way out of this situation that might not be so different from what I'm saying here. He knows the potential economic and security costs of the current path aren't worth it. He has an admirable record of growing Israel's GDP, and despite his reputation, with some, has had, by Israeli standards, a relatively peaceful tenure. And we're supposed to build vibrant communities outside of Israel as well. There are extremes in the Jewish community which are growing more extreme, and would everybody if the center does not hold. Remember, synagogues like this have a core role to play in the Jewish future. It is essential we don't turn things over to those on the extremes. We have an essential role here. As one of the precious few generations fortunate enough to witness Zion reborn, we cannot shrug our shoulders and say, what Israel is of no concern to me. I don't live there. It's worthwhile to be a committed Zionist, to care about the fate of all the people of Israel, to make clear that Jews care about each other, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Lazeh, even when we disagree. Solidarity, of course, is only meaningful with those with whom we disagree. It's easy to feel connected to people who think you're right. Ultimately, in 1973, 50 years ago, Israel used the arms the U.S. supplied to better effect than the Arab nations used their Soviet arms. For instance, in aerial dogfights, Israeli fighter pilots downed 277 enemy craft, while losing only 6, which is a 46-to-1 ratio. But Israeli losses were great, much greater than the Six-Day War, and the conceptia, the idea of Israeli invulnerability, was a casualty of war. The Torah says that if Israel has a king, that king has to write a copy of the Torah scroll, study it, and abide by it. There are limits to his power. That was in a world where it was felt God would intervene to keep things on the right track. Israel has no king, and God doesn't zap down miracles to save the day, but that principle of having check on power remains. Jews don't always agree. Maybe that Jews always disagree. So you don't need to agree with the actions of this or that government. But we can't confuse agreement with love. When you love someone, you will stand by them even when you disagree. The same is true with Israel. When you love a place, the way I and so many of us love that place, we'll stand with them even in times of disagreement. But we will never stop advocating for what's best. And we will never lose hope. Hatikva, the hope of 2,000 years. As Israel's birth after the darkness of Shoah taught us, as Israel's security after the initial setbacks of the Yom Kippur War 50 years ago taught us, we know that sometimes, just when things are darkest, the Jewish people are to know that hope is not yet lost. Shana Tova Tikatevu, may we and all Israel be inscribed for a year of peace, of justice, and of hope.